All right, good morning again and welcome everyone. This session is entitled Quantitative Analysis. I'm David Roland-Holst from UC Berkeley. This session is entitled Quantitative Analysis of the Impacts of AB 32 on California's Economy. I think if I could choose a subtitle, it would be Reasonable People Can Disagree. And when you consider the subject, which is the world's 8th largest economy, and something as complex and pervasive as AB 32, as a policy and carry that forward for a decade or two, then certainly it's reasonable to expect a diversity of opinions about what course the economy will take over this time. And I think we're very fortunate to have the primary contributors to these macroeconomic assessments of the state. But before we look at individual results, I think we can all agree that one of the unambiguous benefits of AB 32 has been to really help us develop a means of conducting the policy dialogue, of navigating these inevitable uncertainties. We can't expunge the uncertainties associated with these policies, but we're really developing evidence-based standards for policy guidance. We're developing ways of talking to each other about the differences, not only in our expectations, but also in our let's say, our apprehensions about the uncertainty. And as I said, we're lucky today to have some major contributors to the empirical assessments and to the evidence can support the public dialogue. One of the reasons this conference was organized was to reaffirm the importance of evidence-based approaches in a time when there's a lot of political discussion, which is sometimes very rhetorical in nature. I think we want to bring ourselves back to more solid foundation of analysis and the facts, and we have some of the highest quality studies today represented, both from the public side and from the private side. We're first going to hear about the two leading macroeconomic assessments, one from the public agency and one from a leading private research entity. There's a third one that was part of this comparison project in the past, and that's a UC Berkeley model, the Berkeley Energy and Resources model, the BEAR model, which was referred to by Larry. Because the results of that model are essentially intermediate between these two, then we felt it's time we focus on the kind of bookend contributions. But these authors have a lot to say, which can inform the policy dialogue. You'll hear a diversity of findings, but I'm going to ask each of them to present their own results without reference to the others, and we'll get back to comparisons and discussion during the question and answer period. So let me begin without any further delay. I want to introduce Kevin Kennedy, who's the Assistant Executive Officer in charge of the Office of Climate Change at CARB, the California Air Resources Board, where he's had broad responsibility for overseeing the implementation of AB 32. Prior to this appointment, he was the chief of the program evaluation branch of OCC, where he led a team responsible for evaluating and developing market-based compliance mechanisms, incentives, voluntary actions, offsets, and other approaches for achieving emissions reductions in support of AB 32. Kevin has been at the center of the analytical capacity to support AB 32's research and implementation, and he has a previous history of working for the California Energy Commission and has been a leading spokesperson for CARB's work on AB 32.
And I'd just like to start today by thanking the Giannini Foundation for hosting this event and for inviting me to participate. I'm looking forward to what I think will be a very good discussion of the various looks that have been done of the economics of AB 32. The main thing that I'm going to be talking about today is the updated economic analysis that ARB completed of implementing the AB 32 scoping plan. This is an analysis we completed earlier this year, presented it to our board in March, and then actually in April had something of a workshop where we invited a number of folks who have been looking at these issues to look at the comparison across the different analyses that have been done and get a better understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the different modeling approaches. That was a very successful afternoon we spent in front of our board trying to explore the same sort of issues we'll be exploring in this session today. What the updated analysis did was to provide an estimate of the state-level economic effects of implementing the full suite of measures in the scoping plan. I want to acknowledge the good work that the Economic and Allocation Advisory Committee did. Professor Goulder mentioned them. He put in many long hours as chair of that committee. He and the other members of the committee were extremely important both in providing recommendations to us in terms of how to allocate allowances within the cap and trade program, but in this context as well, a subset of the committee worked very closely with our staff as we were developing this analysis, providing us very good input and insight as we went along. So this was an update of the analysis that we originally did when we adopted the scoping plan. And there are a number of things that we did differently in trying to improve the assessment. One of the things that we did between when we adopted the scoping plan and when we completed this analysis, the economic situation in the country and the world had changed significantly. So we updated the business as usual projection using updated economic forecasts reflecting the economic downturn that we're still in. We also moved a couple of the major regulations that were part of the scoping plan into the business as usual. Those are the Pavley clean car regulations that had been adopted several years earlier and now are the basis of the new federal auto greenhouse gas standards that are going into effect. And the 20% RPS, also something that had been adopted by law some years before. So we moved those into business as usual. We were also able to improve our analytic approach by using a dual modeling approach with both Energy 2020 and the EDRAM model. And I'll talk a little bit more about the nature of those two models in just a second. One of the other differences in terms of this analysis is we were able to do a number of sensitivity cases to take a look at what might play out if some of the underlying assumptions were a bit different. So Energy 2020 is a detailed energy model, North American in scope, that simulates the supply, price, and demand for all fuels throughout the economy. This provides a very good basis of information for taking a look at and analyzing what happens in terms of the energy flows as you make different assumptions about how that is going to play out. The EDRAM model is a California-based model that takes a look at the macro economy of California, provides information on income levels, employment, and those sorts of things. By using the two very different types of models in conjunction with each other, we think that we've been able to get a better handle on what's going on with the economy overall. In terms of the measures that were included in the analysis, the real focus of the analysis was on the major measures that have been included in the scoping plan. Electricity and natural gas efficiency programs, a 33% renewable energy standard, which was adopted by regulation by our board a bit more than a week ago. Increased use of combined heat and power. Increasing the use of very efficient combined heat and power can have a very important role in helping reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Regional reduction targets in terms of transportation planning. This is another measure that our board adopted the regional targets a bit more than a week ago. So action is moving on there. California's clean car standards, sometimes referred to as Pavley 2, LEV 3. Actually, we're increasingly referring to these as the advanced clean car standards as we bring the Pavley standards, the LEV 3 work, and the zero emission vehicle programs together for a more integrated clean car program. That next round of standards, which would apply to the 2017 model years and beyond, we're anticipating taking to our board early next year. There are also measures related to goods movement. We included the low carbon fuel standard, and of course we included cap and trade in the analysis. We did look at 5 different cases. The first case was essentially our main policy case. This is the full implementation of all the measures in the scoping plan as designed and intended. In case 2, we took a look at an alternative within the design of the cap and trade program. What would be the economic effects if we actually did not allow offsets at all in the cap and trade program? For the other 3 cases, we looked at variations on what would happen in terms of the economics if we were less successful in the implementation of a number of the other, what we call complementary measures, things like the clean car standards, low carbon fuel standard, renewable standards, if those were less effective than we assumed in the scoping plan at getting the reductions at the sort of costs that we believe are possible. In case 3, we said, what if we get less out of the transportation sector measures? In case 4, we asked what would happen if we got less from the electricity and natural gas measures. And then as something of a worst case, in case 5, we said, what if we get less from both the transportation and electricity and natural gas measures? In all of these cases, we were looking at a situation where we were still going to be able to achieve the AB 32 reduction targets and get the 2020 emissions back to 1990 levels. The main study results were that the California's emissions target can in fact be achieved while maintaining strong economic growth looking out over the next decade. The degree of growth is very slightly less than it would have been otherwise. You see the total size of the California economy a little bit less in 2020 with these policies implemented than without them. But it's useful to keep in context what we're looking at is a question of how much growth over the next decade we'd be seeing rather than a question of whether or not there will be growth. We also saw that less effective implementation of some of the complementary measures we would expect to actually increase costs of the program overall and increase the effect on the California economy. We also saw that the use of offsets is a very important policy tool in helping keep the overall costs of the program down. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the numbers that are in the next few slides. This first slide is providing the context that I mentioned, taking a look at what was the reference year for the analysis, the 2007 data on gross state product, personal income, income per capita, and labor demand, and then the reference case without implementation of the scoping plan, what the models assumed that the California economy would look like in 2020. In terms of gross state product and personal income, you'd be looking at growth on the order of 2.4% per year on average. Income per capita, about half that rate of growth, and labor demand increasing from 16.4 million to 18.4 million for an increase of just under 1% per year. When we look at the question of then what happens if we implement the scoping plan, assuming that ARB is correct in our assumptions about how that will play out, we see that the differences from the reference case are extremely small. You have to essentially go to 4 significant digits on most of the major measures before you actually see any difference. When you look at the annual average growth going out to 2020, you don't see any change that's measurable, at 2 significant digits. One of the measures that we were looking at in terms of the economic analysis, as we're implementing the cap and trade program, what does the model tell us that the allowance price would be? And what would be the price of allowances? What would they be trading at? In the scoping plan case, our result for that for 2020 was $21 per ton. As we look at the sensitivity cases, again, we see small differences, for the most part, somewhat larger differences than we did for the scoping plan case. But again, very small differences from the business as usual look at what you would see in 2020. Again, looking at the annual average rate of growth from the 2007 reference year out to 2020, in some cases you see the rate of growth declining by 0.1% on average. So we see very little effect in terms of the rate of California growth going out through the years. You do see some very significant differences in terms of what the allowances would be trading at in the cap and trade program. If there were no offsets, that sensitivity case suggested that the allowances would trade over $100 a ton rather than just over $20 a ton. If you got less out of the transportation measures, the effect on allowance price is less. You're looking at $40 rather than the $20. When you bring the less effective electricity and natural gas measures into it, you get more of an effect. And when you combine, both transportation, electricity, and natural gas, once again, the allowance prices would be up over $100 a ton. One of the things that we've been doing as we've been designing the cap and trade program is taking these sorts of results into consideration and trying to figure out, are there good ways of designing into the program cost containment features that would help us avoid getting to the situation where you would see prices rising to the sort of very high levels that you're looking at in these results. I'm not going to say a lot about that today because we're still in the process of finalizing the cap and trade proposal that we'll be releasing later this month. But I just want to acknowledge that that's one area where we're taking a look at these results and saying, okay, the sort of impacts that you're seeing, the sort of prices you're seeing, are there ways of trying to minimize that and avoid those more extreme cases? I know I'm not supposed to be doing anything about comparing my results to everyone else's results, but I do just want to sort of make a couple of quick points on that the results of what we found in this updated analysis are very consistent with the other economic analyses of AB 32 and of federal climate change proposals. The modeling approaches, though they differ in terms of the approach, all reach very similar conclusions, that the impacts on gross domestic product are small relative to the projected growth between now and 2020. We have a graph that we used when we presented the results to the board, just sort of showing as a percent of business as usual in terms of the gross domestic product, how the different analyses came out. And generally, with one exception, it was 99 or 100%. There was one that was as low as 97%. So very small changes in terms of what's going on in 2020. So the conclusion that we draw from that is that we really are, the analysis shows that we can implement the strategies in the scoping plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in a way that is cost effective for California and has very little impact on the California economy, that the rate of growth remains virtually unchanged. The cap and trade proposal that's due out in late October, later this month, will have its own economic analysis and will build to a very large extent on the analysis that I'm talking about here that we did as the updated analysis for the scoping plan. Given the discussion that we had on the previous panel, I think it's useful for me to actually add a few things slightly off topic just in terms of the work that ARB is doing. We certainly have heard a lot of concerns about whether or not it makes sense for California to be doing this program alone. We disagree with the premise. We are not acting alone. The Western Climate Initiative is very active and continuing to move forward. It is true that only 5 of the partner jurisdictions are planning to start their cap and trade program in 2012, us, New Mexico, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec. But we are working very closely together to make sure that that is a coordinated launch to a regional program. We're also continuing to work with the full partnership of all 11 jurisdictions in terms of discussing where there's opportunities to coordinate on complementary policies, where else in climate policy, even for those partners that are not moving forward on cap and trade, it makes sense to have coordinated action. We're also hoping that that will attract some additional partners into the WCI fold. We have a number of observer jurisdictions that weren't interested in cap and trade, and while much of the focus over the last couple of years has been on designing the regional cap and trade program, we think that the broader focus may provide some additional interest. We're also working in the context of what's called the 3 regions effort, the Western Climate Initiative, the RGGI program in the northeastern states, and the Midwest Governors Accord. We have been having regular discussions amongst representatives of all 3 regions to talk about how best to coordinate exactly the sort of de facto national policy out of the active work at the regional levels. We're not at this point where we in California or we in WCI are specifically looking to link with the RGGI program. It's a much narrower program than we're looking at. But the RGGI states are committed to a reevaluation of their program that's supposed to be completed in 2013. And we're very interested in seeing the results of that to see whether what comes out of that is something that actually does make sense to link across from WCI to RGGI. Similarly, we've been working internationally. One of the things that has been an emphasis for Governor Schwarzenegger is the importance of subnational action on climate change, not just for California, but throughout the country and throughout the world. For example, with the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, We've been working on helping develop a sectoral crediting program for international forestry projects with states and provinces in Brazil, Indonesia, and Mexico. And we think that we can make a lot of difference in terms of helping develop a framework for a sectoral approach to international offset credits that could provide an alternate framework, not necessarily to replace the CDM framework, but that we think would have a lot of important additional ability to bring others into the program and get some good reductions going in a cost-effective way. So California is very much moving ahead with the program. We do believe that the leadership role that we are playing continues to be important on a number of different ways, but we're also working very closely with a variety of partners across the country and across the world in order to make sure that we're not going it alone. And we will be continuing as we implement the program. We are required to update the scoping plan by 2013. We believe that that will provide an excellent opportunity to sort of take a look at the national and regional situation and the international situation and sort of say, here's what we have achieved in California and here's what we'll be able to achieve going forward. So with that, I think I'm done.
Next speaker. Now we're going to be hearing Sugandha D. Tuladhar, who's representing Charles Rivers Associates, a leading global consulting firm that offers economic, financial, and management expertise to firms, industries, and governments. The CRA have been doing assessments now since the inception of the AB legislative debates in 2005. And they provide a very convenient reference point for, I would say, private sector perspectives on macroeconomic assessment. Sugandha's current research focuses on economic impacts of climate change policy, and he specializes in building these large general equilibrium models. He was part of a team that analyzed AB 32 in collaboration with their resources board in a comparison project between, I guess, sort of the three of us, really, CARB's own model, the Bear model, and CRA's model. So we'll hear from Sugandha now about CRA's results.
Thanks, David. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting Charles River Associate to be a part of it. And unfortunately, like David Montgomery, who was supposed to be here to deliver his presentation, could not come due to unavoidable circumstances back home. So I'm kind of stepping up for David. And this particular work was performed at the invitation and in collaboration with ARB. So, as an overview of the study, we basically modeled 5 core cases as Kevin laid out, ARB's 5 core cases under input assumptions similar to theirs. In addition, we've also ran multiple other cases such that scenarios such that the ARB, similar to ARB, had analyzed as well as CRA's own assumptions, so as to investigate the sensitivity of the compliance costs to the assumptions about technology costs, economic forecasts, and implication of California joining the National Climate Change Program. So in general, for today's presentation, we'll be mainly focusing on 5 different scenarios that are laid out there. The first one is the SP, the scoping plan. As Kevin said, it's the case 1 of ARB, which includes all the complementary measures. And in terms of complementary measures, we've kind of heard about it in the morning as well as in Kevin's presentation. That includes LCFS, RPS, energy efficiency programs, and CHIP programs, and 4% VMT reductions. So the SP case 1 basically includes all of the complementary measures. Then we've got a cap and trade program, which is basically a market-based oriented program, which excludes all the complementary measures, and it includes ARB cost assumptions as well as the offsets availability. The third scenario that we'll be looking at today is the SP alternate. That's basically, we're going to assume our own cost estimates for technology costs, as well include all the complementary measures and the offset that is consistent with ARB's analysis. The fourth result that we'll be looking at is the SP no-off, which is essentially case 2 of ARB, which includes all the complementary, and it assumes cost assumptions of ARB, and it does not allow any offset availability. And the final set of results that we'll be looking at is for SPWMOS. It's basically same as SP, which is the case 1, the only difference being that the offset availability is consistent with Waxman Markey's offset availability. For this analysis, we use our CRA's mRNA model for the analysis. So let me go with a summary, although David said I should not be comparing models. I wasn't aware of it, so. So in general, our analysis, our impacts greatly dependent on the treatment of complementary measures, offsets, and technology cost assumptions. Our carbon prices basically range from $50 to $80 per metric ton of CO2. Similarly, our cost range per capita was about $200 to $500, depending upon the different assumptions that we undertook. One thing in common with ARB is that we find that 4% offset significantly reduces cost of meeting emission target with permit prices, reducing by about 33% for CRA and 80% for ARB. So offset is a good policy instrument choice in both of our models. CRA, however, we differ in how command and control measures affect policy costs. CRA finds that measures that reduce flexibility, that is the complementary measures that we've talked about, increases cost of complying with AB 32, whereas ARB finds that these measures reduces costs. In particular, I want to kind of touch two complementary measures, that is the RES, which is the Renewable Energy Standard, and the LCFS, which contributes most of the added cost that we see in our analysis. CRA and ARB model are sensitive to inputs about technology costs, economic forecast, development of, and the flexibility of policy design. So we'll look at some of the policy design issues and how it impacts the cost. In specific, if we account for higher costs of procuring and delivering low carbon fuels to California fleet, we see that the cost of complying with our LCFS increases the program cost by about 40%. Similarly, if we change the economic forecast of California from IEPR 2009 emission forecast, which is rather low forecast, to a more higher emission forecast according to 2008 scoping plan, which is based on IPR 2007 emission forecast, then we see a much higher cost under the old forecast. One thing we do come to a very close results between ARB's modeling results and ours is on case 5, which has the least amount of complementary measures included. If you look at ARB's model and our model, we see that our model cost estimates is about $290 per capita, while ARB is about $270. So we do agree on sort of this cost measure for the case 5. Now, speaking of complementary measures, now we basically first, our central case is always the SP, which is the scoping plan, as shown here by the red dot. Then we look at what if we remove the complementary measures and we go to a full-fledged market-based mechanism, that is a cap and trade method, cap and trade program. Under the cap and trade program, when we remove all the complementary measures, we see that the cost is reduced drastically. At the same time, carbon prices increase. So in general, the carbon price is not a good indicator of the cost measures. So overall costs cannot be inferred from CO2 prices because AB 32 combines a market-based program to reduce carbon emissions, right, with command and control mechanism. So in terms of this particular results, where if you look at the horizontal line, it's basically our societal cost, which is a welfare measure over between 2010 and 2020, we've basically taken a net present value of the societal cost, and the vertical axis is the carbon price there. So both of these, SP as well as command and cap and trade program, basically achieve the same cap. the complementary measure prescribes more expensive carbon reduction than the cap-and-trade program alone, resulting in a much lower carbon price under the SP. Most of this cost that's associated with SP comes from implementation of these two complementary measures that I've spoken about. That's the Renewable Energy Standard and the LCFS are primary source of our cost increase measures. And the energy efficiency standards as part of the other complementary measures, well, they do address the market failures associated with energy use. Second, as Kevin indicated, that allowing offsets basically mitigates the cost of AB 32. Here we've shown, again, starting with SP, which is the central case, we've allowed no offset in the case of SP, no offset. And in the bottom blue dot, that's basically SP with Waxman type of offset, where there's plenty of offset going up to maximum of 2 billion metric ton of CO2 and max of international offset about 1.5 billion metric ton. So we clearly see that without any offset, the cost of the program increases at the same time increasing the carbon cost, while if we allow for plentiful offset, then the cost of the program reduces. Similarly, the carbon prices also reduce. So allowing for flexible mechanism are valuable for mitigating cost increases due to higher than expected emissions and technology costs. So in both of our models, even if you look at different cost structures, as well as different emission paths that I've described, we always see that offset is a good policy design options for mitigating costs. Now, talking about the cost structure, well, we've adopted in our base cases, in the SP, we've basically taken the ARB cost. We've harmonized our underlying cost of biofuels that can be introduced. However, we think that those costs are very low, and we've used our internal cost estimates based on industry folks and feedback from the industry. So we've used a higher cost that basically reflects the cost of producing ethanol or producing biodiesel for the trucking sector, and that is reflected under SP all scenario. So if we use a higher cost of ethanol and other biofuels, alternative transportation fuel, we see that the societal cost drastically increases, in excess of $40 billion from our central case, without really impacting the carbon prices. So in summary, accounting for a higher cost of procuring and delivering the low carbon fuels to the California fleet raises the cost of complying with the LCFS. Again, this has a direct bearing on the compliance cost of LCFS if we assume a realistic cost of these biofuels coming on. Now, putting all these policies that we've seen together in a sort of a spider form, we can see that the carbon price as well as the costs are diverging in all patterns. Starting from the central case, SP10, we see, again, just to summarize, having offset is good, that reduces the cost. So for policymakers, we need to be aware of what are the policy options that provide some relief to the consumer at large by reducing the societal cost. And we need to also be aware that these complementary measures basically adds additional cost to the society. And as we move away from this command and control mechanism framework to a more market-based mechanism with carbon cap and trade program, then the cost is much lower for the society as a whole. So in conclusion, our basic analysis show that increased reliance on market-based approach, such as cap and trade, can achieve the emission target at substantially lower cost than the scoping plans approach that relies heavily on the complementary mechanism or the measures. In specific, as I said, the two complementary measures, RES and LCFS, cause most of the avoidable cost in our policy runs. Policy design choices have important impacts on the total cost. One of the policy design option is the offset, and as I showed in various slides, that having offset is good, and 4% offset lower program costs of permit price by 15 and 33% in our case. Increasing availability of offset that is consistent with Waxman-Markey basically reduces the societal cost for California. Similarly, external factors such as higher technology cost or maybe different emission growth patterns that basically defines our base case also has impact on how the cost can be measured. In specific, we've taken a look at if we use a higher emission path, then the societal cost is going to be high for California. While if we look at a lower emission path trajectory that is consistent with the current 2009 IEPR forecast, then we naturally see lower cost associated. So it depends on what sort of forecast assumption one is using in order to define the base case. So we need to be aware of the sensitivity of those as well. Similarly, we've run other cases which, due to time availability, I did not present here. We're looking at what happens to California if it was to be linked with a national cap and trade program. So we see that if one was to replace or link AB 32 with a national cap and trade program, in this case we took Waxman-Markey as the kind of a national cap and trade program, it would lower the cost by 50% and achieve similar contribution to global emission reduction in the long run. So overall, as a policymaker, we need to be aware of what are the cost containment measures, how the policy should be designed. But at the end of the day, our basically analysis says that by layering on complementary measures, it adds additional cost to the people of California. And with those, I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Now we're going to shift back to a public perspective, and we're fortunate to have two representatives from the Legislative Analyst's office today to help us see things from more of a direct public finance perspective. And I'm going to introduce you in order of seniority, if you don't mind, not alphabetical order, and that may be more customary in an official setting. Mark C. Newton is the Director of Resources and Environmental Protection in the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office. He has been involved in management of numerous AB 32 related analyses, including critiques of the Air Resources Board's economic analysis, supporting its AB 32 scoping plan, as well as analyses of AB 32's job impacts, the economic impacts of California's, quote, going it alone on climate change policy, and budget issues arising from AB 32 implementation. The LAO's analysis of Proposition 23, including its fiscal impacts, was recently completed for inclusion in the November 2010 election voter information guide. Mark will be accompanied by James Nachbaur, who is an economist in the LAO. Many of the same comments apply to James' work. I think you've been collaborating throughout a lot of this, so I won't repeat all of those details. But the LAO is providing a very important reference for the public perspective on these policies. So let me ask you to go ahead. We don't have slides for this presentation, so they're going to speak directly from the table. Please, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mark Newton with the LAO. Just very briefly to recap who our office is and to give you some context to our presentation, I think it would be important to mention sort of how the LAO what its role has been in AB 32 related economic analyses. So as was mentioned, our office is a nonpartisan office within the legislature. We give nonpartisan fiscal and policy advice to the legislature as a whole, work clearly for both houses, both parties. Our flagship work is probably our work on the budget. We analyze the governor's budget proposal, make recommendations to the legislature on the budget. Our AB 32 related economic work has come from a number of sources, and a key source has been direct request from legislators themselves. And just want to let you know that when we receive a request from a legislator, our response, the request itself and our response is confidential unless it is made public by that legislator. A lot of our AB 32 related work has been made public by those members, and those are the responses that we'll be talking about this morning. We've done additional work that sort of remains confidential. So when members are asking us to look at an AB 32 related issue, basically what are they asking us to do? And I should point out that generally we're being asked to review the work of others and not do our own sort of independent modeling. So what sort of things have we been asked to look at? And I'll just give you sort of three brief sort of categories of requests that we've received and that we'll be talking about during the presentation. One thing we've been asked to do is to specifically to critique sort of the analysis and findings of a state agency that has done some economic analysis work related to AB 32, and are the findings reasonable? So in that regard, we've been asked, as was mentioned, to critique the Air Resources Board's economic analysis of the scoping plan to implement AB 32. In other cases, we've been asked to try to reconcile findings of several different economics studies or analyses that have come to different results. And in that regard, we were asked to reconcile studies on the issue of jobs, the job impact of AB 32, and some studies that showed significant job losses, others that showed significant job gains. What's the net result? Trying to reconcile those. We've been asked that. And finally, we've also been asked to fill in some gap in the economic analysis that was perhaps identified by the member. And one issue that we were asked to look at is specifically to consider the costs of what's called economic leakage to California when it relatively goes alone on climate policy. And it was felt by one member that was an analysis issue that wasn't fully considered in the Air Resources Board's analysis. So before turning to some of our work, I thought it would be important to give a little bit of a legal and legislative context to the issue of economic analysis and what actually law requires in terms of economic analysis that needs to be done, and two places to turn. And one is AB 32 itself. There are a few requirements in AB 32 that do speak or trigger an economic analysis requirement. But I should note they're very, very broadly written without too much guidance. But a key one is that the scoping plan that is to be developed by the Air Resources Board, as well as regulations developed thereunder, are to achieve, and I'm quoting directly here, the maximum technologically feasible and cost-effective reductions in greenhouse gas emission reductions. So the cost-effective criteria, while not defined, it is something that does demand or trigger the need for economic analysis. That's the main criteria in AB 32 that relates to this issue. There are some requirements for the ARB to, quote, consider cost effectiveness, to evaluate, potential total costs and economic benefits, but the cost-effective reduction criteria is the main one. Now, law also requires certain economic analyses when regulations are adopted in the state. And this applies to all regulations, not just regulations adopted under AB 32. And I should note that most of the requirements in law are on the cost side of the ledger, that state law does not require cost-benefit analyses to be developed when regulations are to be adopted, or the consideration of cost-effectiveness criteria that really isn't in law. But basically, law states that state agencies are to consider the potential adverse impact on economic impact on business, the impact on small business, the impacts on jobs. So basically, this cost side focus. I know that Professor Stavens has interest in the California regulatory process versus the federal process, and there's some very key differences between the state and federal processes, and a number of things that are lacking in the state process that are found federally. So for instance, the federal process does involve some centralization of the review of regulations and their economic impact, independent review, and guidelines that guide the process. So that's lacking in California. And there's been some talk of California perhaps moving to the federal system with more meat and guidance in terms of how we analyze the economic impact of what we're proposing to do. So turning to some of our office's work, and one of our office's major first pieces of work was on the issue of where we were asked to critique the economic analysis that the Air Resources Board did in support of its scoping plan for AB 32. And that was the initial economic analysis was released in the fall of 2008. And perhaps why we were asked to, or what we were asked to look at, is that at that time, the Air Resources Board's bottom line finding was that there was a net economic benefit, a net benefit, positive benefit to the economy from implementing the plan. It was a slight, not a major increase in gross state product, but it was about 0.3%. But it was the direction was positive. So we were asked to stand back and look at the ARB's work and critique sort of how well that finding, that bottom line finding was supported. I guess our office's goal in responding to that request is trying to be helpful and going forward, trying to recommend steps to the administration, to the legislature that in the end would help improve AB 32 related decision making and to help ensure that this important legislation was being implemented cost effectively and efficiently. We had a number of issues with the ARB's work that we raised. I mean, a lot of good work certainly was done by the ARB, but some points that we raised just very, very quickly, that at that time there were some costs and savings of certain measures that had yet to be developed. So there was essentially a blank in the scoping plan analysis, and cap and trade was a key one. There was the issue of the lack of sensitivity analysis, and Kevin mentioned some scenario analysis that has since been done. When we were talking about sensitivity analysis, we were largely talking about, it was a realization that the economic analysis of AB 32 and the plan was based on a lot of very critical assumptions. Some of the assumptions were the sort of energy price forecasts, but really key critical assumptions were the actual direct costs and savings from implementing the various measures. And when we said that sensitivity analysis was required, generally what we were looking for was testing what the outcome would be under another set of assumptions that that are still reasonable in terms of sort of the cost and savings and economic impact of the measures. And a final issue was, I guess, two other issues. One was a lack of an investment pathway. The economic analysis that was done by the ARB focused on where the state would be in 2020 in terms of impacts, but the timing of the investments necessary to be made by business to comply with AB 32 on a year-by-year basis would be very important to help guide business investment and provide some certainty. But I guess if we had an overall issue with the work that had been done, or it perhaps was an untapped opportunity to use economic analysis to actually inform decision-making. So often in the state, economic analysis is done after the fact, after the decision has been made, and to analyze, well, what are the impacts of the decision that's been made, as opposed to actually using the analysis to influence the decision and help in ensuring that what you're doing is cost-effective and efficient. So we presented our findings to the legislature and which were made, or to the member, which were made public. The Air Resources Board adopted a resolution to direct that additional analysis be done, addressing a number of issues that we raised. And as Kevin mentioned, there was an updated economic analysis that, in our view, was a significant improvement from what had been done before. Still a few gaps, and I think if we have a major concern on this issue, it continues to be sort of this untapped opportunity to use economic analysis to actually in the design of the system and to influence your policy choices. It's been done to some degree, but perhaps could be done more. So that's where we stand on that issue, and I will turn to my colleague James Nachbaur, who will speak to some other LAO work products, and we'll end with a specific discussion on where our office came out in terms of analyzing the fiscal impact of Proposition 23 that's on the November ballot.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So first, we don't have a computable general equilibrium model of our own, but we have examined the CGE modeling done by others. And I'm just going to go over now a few of our concerns, and then I'll spend a few minutes on two of the member requests that Mark mentioned.
Just pull it a little closer.
Thanks. So we just have a couple concerns on the CGE modeling, and then I'll get to the two member requests that Mark mentioned. In general, we think a lot has been left out of the CGE modeling. And we realize that no model can capture everything, but that there are important classes of impacts of the scoping plan on the economy that were not considered adequately. One, for example, would be links between the scoping plan and national or state policies that exist or may exist in the future. Second are policy-induced energy efficiency gains. These were looked at by some of the modelers, but not all of them. Third would be health benefits from scoping plan actions, which of course can equate to economic benefits. And finally, economic leakage and possible benefits for California sectors of being market leaders were not modeled with much detail in terms of industries or sub-industries affected. And between the other two presentations, you heard different approaches to market imperfections, or whether the complementary measures are increasing or decreasing costs. So at a fundamental level, CGE models inherently assume that consumers and businesses have taken advantage of available opportunities to maximize their well-being and profits. So it's thus hard to fit possible market imperfections into CGE models. So the BEAR modelers and the ARB modeling teams and others believe that these market imperfections are important, and we appreciate their attempts to address them, but that said, we would have been happier if more sensitivity analyses had been done on the magnitudes of these potential effects. So our bottom line on the CG modeling, and we have more comments in our publications, is that these models are not ideal and could have been done differently, but they do offer some insight. And it is certainly very valuable to have all three of the modeling analyses that have been done. The disagreements help focus attention on policy design and on the uncertainties involved in scoping plan implementation. So one of the requests I'm going to discuss is a letter we sent to Senator Cogdill on March 4th, which he made public. His specific request was for an analysis of the net impacts on jobs in California that would occur as a result of the implementation of AB 32. And although our response focused on jobs because that was the specific nature of his request, we did point out that employment effects are but one of many ways the scoping plan will affect the economy. So why would there be job effects? There's probably no need to go into this in any great detail here, but just a brief list. We've got energy prices going up, the types of energy used are changing, vehicle fuel standards are tightening, benefits from mandated energy efficiencies may occur, there are energy-related investments required, regulatory-related compliance costs will be imposed, and trade flows may be altered. And on top of all that, you've got green technology or economic development and leadership possible. So those are all things we know are in play. We faced additional uncertainties, including that the scoping plan is still under development. We don't know, for example, in a cap-and-trade program, how any revenue that is raised might be spent. Also, there are energy-related technological changes that will be occurring over the forecast period, and those could be better or worse than expected. Third, federal and state policies in other jurisdictions are changing. And finally, there's generally not a simple relationship between policy changes and job impacts. So our judgment in the end was that in the near term, the implementation of AB 32 through the scoping plan would result in California job losses, even after recognizing that many of the scoping plan's programs phase in over time. And this reflects the impacts of the various economic dislocations, behavioral adjustments, and investment requirements. In the longer term, however, we feel the economic effects are unknown, and they will depend on a number of yet-to-be-determined factors, which include future energy prices, technological change, legislative actions, and the state of the economy otherwise. So our bottom line is that certain individuals and businesses will be seriously affected, but that the changes which may occur won't prove particularly large relative to the overall economy. And the second member request I'm going to get into is a letter we sent to Assemblymember Logue on May 13th, which he made public. And his specific request was that we conduct a qualitative analysis of the costs of California taking action without there being a shared consensus and involvement across the nation in terms of how the issue is addressed. So what is economic leakage? When the costs of doing business in California rise relative to those costs in other places, certain firms may decide to relocate outside of California, not expand in California, or take similar actions, and this is economic leakage. For this letter, we focused mainly on how the implementation of the scoping plan is expected to raise the prices of energy in California and cause firms to face certain investment requirements. All else equal, we feel those two factors will make the costs of doing business in California increase and will cause some economic leakage. But the big question is, to what extent? Particularly susceptible to leakage are industries whose production processes are highly reliant upon energy as an input, that are also engaged in trade-related activities and also encounter or might encounter a high level of competition from outside the state. So note, leakage pressures could be outweighed by other factors, such as companies' need for proximity to their customers, their need for an access to a qualified labor force, and in the short term, their actual costs of relocating outside of the state. So in our judgment, a small share of California's economy falls into this highest risk, energy-intensive, trade-exposed category. And that's because over the past couple of decades, our economy has become increasingly service-based, and a relatively limited percentage of the state's economic activity is carried out by industries which are both highly trade-exposed and highly energy-dependent. So this means that instead of significant economic leakage, the scoping plan will likely result in some inflationary pressures throughout the state economy. Also, climate policies in other jurisdictions matter. The greater the extent to which California is a policy outlier, the greater the risk of leakage. And California is a leader, but California is not alone. And this limits the degree of leakage. So finally, policy actions to mitigate leakage are also important, including slower phase-ins, free allocation of allowances under cap and trade, or greater use of offsets. So our bottom line is that leakage is a risk, but that industries highly susceptible to economic leakage comprise only a modest share of the economy, and so the likely adverse impacts will probably be modest.
If I may conclude, and I'll be very tight in the presentation on our analysis of Proposition 23, which is a statutory requirement of our office to provide a fiscal analysis that goes into the voter guide. I should note, what does fiscal analysis mean? It's actually fiscal impact on state and local governments, both on the cost and revenue side, but any general impact of an initiative measure on the economy is very relevant because that plays into the revenue situation of government. Very briefly, you may be aware of the Proposition 23, what it would do. It's quite simple in its language. It would essentially suspend AB 32 until California's unemployment rate is 5.5% for 4 consecutive quarters or 1 year. As you may know, California's unemployment rate is currently above 12%. There are a couple key implementation issues with just understanding the proposition, and this is pretty key to understanding its economic impact. What would be suspended when AB 32 is suspended is any regulation or measure that achieves its authority from AB 32. So one key implementation issue is when if AB 32 were to be suspended, what actually gets suspended in terms of climate change regulation and activity? It's not everything. It's a subset of that. Then the second sort of implementation issue is given California's unemployment rate history and current rate, how long would AB 32 likely be suspended if Proposition 23 were enacted? So on both those issues, we perform an analysis, because as I said, those two issues are very relevant to the impact of the proposition. So in terms of the issue of what actually would get suspended, our analysis, which tracks actually an analysis that just came out by UC San Diego School of Law on this issue, and that is that roughly 1/2 of the reductions in the scoping plan, the greenhouse gas emission reductions, relate to measures that can attach themselves to some law other than AB 32. So those would continue, those measures would continue even if Proposition 23 were enacted. But roughly 1/2 of the emission reductions are based on AB 32 giving the authority for the measure, and those would be suspended. In terms of how long AB 32 would likely be suspended under the measure, it would be suspended immediately and likely remain suspended for many years, was our bottom line conclusion. Unemployment, we did from an historical perspective, unemployment at or below 5.5%. There were essentially 3 periods of roughly 10 quarters each, that's 2.5 quarters each, between 1970 and today, where unemployment was at that level. So based on current rates, history, forecasts, it looks like it would be many years before AB 32 would come back online. In terms of fiscal analysis, just to give you very briefly the bottom line, the main fiscal impact is the potential impacts on the economy. We recognize both positive economic impacts from suspending AB 32, but also negative economic impacts. Some of the negatives include sort of the delay in job-creating clean energy sectors, also the halting of air quality improvements that provide economic-related public health benefits. That's the negative side. So in the end, what we had to do is balance the positives and the negatives. And on balance, our view, and this is a judgment call, was that there would be modestly higher economic activity in the state at 2020 if AB 32 were suspended. But in terms of the overall size of the economy, a relatively slight uptick. So we'll be happy to answer questions of the audience.
He's a research associate at the University of California Energy Institute and a faculty associate at UC Davis Institute of Transportation. Chris's current research focuses on carbon policy, biofuels, and automotive-based pollution. He's also a member of the CARB's EAC, the California Air Resources Board Economics and Allocation Advisory Committee, for the AB 32 implementation plan. I hope that you're all aware that the EAC is really the decisive advisory panel for crafting the implementation strategy for AB 32. Chris, please go ahead.
Typically at an academic conference, the discussant would get into the nitty-gritty of these models. That's just not going to happen today, and certainly in 15 minutes. One, because a lot of these models have hundreds of equations, maybe 1,000 parameters, and also they're proprietary. Some of these I can't even look at. So what I thought I would do is kind of give a general overview of what these models are doing, where they might go wrong, and some potential improvements in how they interact with each other. So first, just a background. Obviously, as we've already mentioned, AB 32 is a package or a suite of policies. It's not just a cap-and-trade program, even though a lot of the popular press and campaign ads seem to suggest it's just cap-and-trade. So what ARB, Charles Rivers Associates, and a number of other organizations have been doing is actually modeling this package. So just from a general standpoint, obviously climate change policy is going to lead to some costs. It's going to lead to costs of selling products that are greenhouse gas intensive. That might either be from changing the actual product to a more fuel efficient vehicle, for example, or just by the fact that I have to buy allowances to sell my product, so I'm going to pass some of those costs on to consumers. Of course, the real cost, or the net cost that we care about, is net of any improvements from that product redesign. So the cost of, say, Pavley or Pavley 2 is the increased costs in building these more fuel-efficient vehicles minus the fuel savings that are going to come from the future fuel savings. Now, Larry Golder's done some great work that has basically shown that most of these costs are going to be borne by consumers. That is, that the price is going to reflect a lot of these costs. Some of these costs will be borne by firms, but that might only be roughly 15 to 20% of the costs. Now, of course, the beauty of a cap-and-trade program, and I'll be getting back to this throughout the talk, is that in principle, cap-and-trade can generate revenues that can be used to offset these costs to consumers. A second cost is just the cost of when prices go up, we consume less of that product, we buy fewer cars, we buy less electricity, and so on. And of course, we got a benefit from those vehicles and that electricity, and that's a cost to society as well. And then the third is that there's macroeconomic costs in the sense that you've just changed prices. You've changed relative prices. Energy's more expensive now. That's going to have more macroeconomic impacts on the economy. That might also be a cost. On the benefit side, you could point to a number of benefits. One is that one of the points of doing climate change policy is that in principle it could lead to a cooler climate. We've been talking all day about the fact that California is a very small portion of global greenhouse gases, so it's not likely to have much of an impact on global climate, which is a reason for pushing for national and international policies. One other benefit, and I'll get back to this later, is that in principle there might be other stuff going on, other market failures economists like to refer to, that might lead to some negative cost items to not be consumed in the economy. And in principle, AB 32 can correct those other market failures and push us to be consuming these products that in principle we should be consuming anyways, but there's something that's keeping us from doing that. The big one, which we haven't really talked about yet today, is that any revenues from a cap-and-trade program can be used to reduce distortionary taxes, income taxes, sales taxes. Those taxes themselves are a drain on the economy. So insofar as we auctioned off permits and used those auction revenues to reduce income taxes or sales taxes, that can have a net benefit to the economy. The models that we've talked about so far have not tried to or attempt to model those macroeconomic benefits. Again, the whole point of correcting a market failure like a negative externality is that the benefits can indeed outweigh the costs. That's a bit hard, like we've been discussing the fact that California is a small portion of the benefits. These benefits are accruing to everyone in the world, so that stacks the deck against this sort of policy being a net benefit to Californians. But again, there might be these other market failures that lead to net cost reducing technologies that just stay out of the market. The other fact of whether the policy is a net benefit is how efficiently it's adopted. To get to that, which these CGE models and Energy 2020, which is a more sectoral model, put together a lot of equations and outspits information about domestic or state income, state employment, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what are these models comprised of? So the first is that you need curves or equations that basically describe technology costs. That, I'm a transportation guy, so let's take that for example. So we institute Pavley 2. That's going to increase the fuel efficiency of our fleet. We need, in order to predict the cost of this, we need information on exactly how much more expensive it will be to produce a car that gets 40 miles a gallon instead of a car that gets 35 miles a gallon. So one of the key parameters or sets of equations in these models are these technology cost curves. And there's lots of them. There's one for transportation, there's one for biofuels, renewable fuels on the electricity side. You then add information about what consumers want to buy and how much utility or how much happiness they get from purchasing these types of vehicles. That's information about demand for goods and services that generate greenhouse gases, and also information about how easy it is for consumers to back off from consuming gasoline or from consuming Cadillac Escalades and so on. What is the utility loss from, instead of buying an Escalade, I'm going to buy a Prius or something like that. The third is a macroeconomic model. These are what these computer general equilibrium models that we've been talking about. These are models that predict general macroeconomic activity and what happens if you change relative prices. And then the fourth, which is part of number 3 actually, is a model of what would happen absent any legislation or any regulation. That's kind of the base. You can add on top of that supply curves for offsets, how easy it is to get offsets from outside of California or from sectors that are not within the cap and trade program, and information or models of leakage and reshuffling. You put all that together, and what gets spit out essentially is what economists would refer to as a marginal abatement cost curve. This says a cost curve. This is actually the marginal abatement. So what this is saying is right at the zero, you see business as usual. That's what would happen if we didn't do anything. As we progressively reduce more and more greenhouse gases, the incremental costs of those reductions go up. Picking the lowest hanging fruit first, all the way to the top of the tree. So for a given reduction, we could predict what total costs are. In this scenario, if we reduce by 10%, the cap and trade, or the cap price, or the allowance price would be $30. That rectangle is not the total cost of this policy. The total cost is actually the area underneath that marginal abatement cost curve. On that screen, it looks orangish. What often gets cited as a total cost is is the rectangle. I'm going to come back to that because that's actually very misleading. That actual orange area can be much smaller than that rectangle. And actually, what's not in the orange area are revenues or net revenues that could be recycled into the economy. Now, of course, you might not pick all of the lowest hanging fruit. And that's where the Charles River model basically says that some of the complementary models are not the lowest hanging fruit, that they're actually outside, or there's a gap between what cap and trade would do and what these complementary measures would do. I've done some work that suggests that the low carbon fuel standard is not a low hanging fruit and is actually more expensive than what would happen under a cap and trade program. So what ends up happening there is you get 2% of your reductions in the more expensive part of that curve, and you reduce your cap, and the cap's only accounting for 8%. So although you've reduced the allowance price, you've actually increased the cost of this regulation. You've increased the cost of getting that 10% reduction. Some of these complementary measures are probably outside of that lowest hanging fruit. Others, because of other market failures or other things that are going on in the economy, might be inside. But if you just did cap and trade, wouldn't be picked. So this is the standard kind of anecdote that consumers just don't care about the efficiency of their refrigerator. They don't care about the efficiency of their air conditioner. And if you increased electricity prices, they don't buy the right refrigerator or the right air conditioner. So that low-hanging fruit is not picked. So in the presence of these other market failures that might be causing that, and I can get a long list of these other market failures that might cause that, but in the presence of these, you have to do more than cap and trade to pick the lowest hanging fruit. So some of these complementary measures might actually be cheap, which would not change the allowance price, or would not change the aggregate cost of doing this legislation. This is a graph that suggests there's a lot of this cheap fruit. It's not only free, it actually somebody picks it, somebody peels it, somebody feeds it to you. This is a kind of famous McKinsey curve that suggests that there's actually a lot of greenhouse gas reducing technologies or actions that are actually free, not only free, but have negative costs. This graph stresses the importance of those technology cost curves that I mentioned as a requirement for these models. Because if you shove one of these, this technology cost curve into a computer general equilibrium model or to any one of these modeling frameworks, you're going to get a very, very low cost to society, if not negative cost to society from doing greenhouse gas reducing actions. Just, personally, my personal standpoint or my personal view is that I can buy individual consumers making mistakes, not buying the right air conditioner or not buying the right even vehicle, although I have some work that suggests they do. But a lot of these are on the firm side. That this curve suggests that there's a lot of firms out there basically leaving $100 bills on the sidewalk. That's more difficult for me to buy or to believe in. But my point is that it's very easy to mislead these models, and I've seen the ARB's technology cost curves. They're not at all like this. But it's very easy to get things wrong in terms of the net costs of these sorts of policies. Going into EAC, these were kind of my priors or my views of what was going on here. One is that these technology cost curves are difficult to come up. You're basically predicting the cost of making a 40-mile-a-gallon vehicle in 2020 relative to the cost of making a 35-mile-a-gallon vehicle. That's hard. You talk to Ford, you talk to GM, they don't know that number. But we have ways of making guesses. The other is that, again, I mentioned that one of the inputs in these models are supply and demand curves. And for a policy, a long-lived policy like climate change policies, what matters is long-run demand elasticities, long-run supply elasticities. And these are just hard to get. I've spent a good part of 5 years of my life trying to nail what the long-run demand elasticity for gasoline is. That says two things. One is I have a boring life, and the other is that these are just very difficult to get. And these models have hundreds of equations, potentially 1,000 of these parameters inside of them, and a lot of them are drawing from academic literature that's less than perfect. Right? To estimate a long-run demand elasticity, ideally you would set up an experiment where you had two Californias, not two Californians. You change the price in one California and you look to see what happens. Economists just don't get to do that. We try, but we don't often get to do. And then finally, I went into microeconomics because I really never bought into macroeconomics. So any macroeconomic model I see, I'm going into it kind of leery. And then one other point, the cost of AB 32, especially my prior of cap and trade, is likely to be small. One reason for that is that the policymakers are going to have a number of levers that they could pull to adjust prices if they get out of whack, right? In the first year of implementation, if the carbon price is $100 a ton, you're going to see some action, either more offsets or changing how much carbon content is in biofuels. So, there's enough play in the system here to influence ex post what the cost of this will be. And then finally, since I already discussed complementary measures, finally, I want to stress that the benefits of AB 32 are going to, one, come from either pushing more federal or more global policy, and then two, from any auctioning of the permits, the ability to reduce other distortionary taxes. Okay, so I already mentioned this, but let me jump here. All right, now going out after we did EAC, what did I feel? So one was I was comforted by the fact that the Charles Rivers Associate model and ARB model was relatively close to each other, and we could actually point to explicit reasons why they do differ, and I'll get back to that in a second. And that a fall in the domestic or state income of 1% to 2% seems about right, but is probably on the high end in the sense that this tax point that I already made. And then a third is that there are these co-benefits, right? So increasing the fuel efficiency of our vehicles or getting rid of low fuel efficient vehicles that are on the road will also benefit criteria pollutants. Those tend to be the dirty vehicles in terms of NOx and carbon monoxide, and those are going to have benefits that ARB and Charles River Associates have not measured. More generally, I think ARBs, for some of the complementary measures, cost estimates tend to be too low, especially the low carbon fuel standard, PAVLI, too. And these kind of magical VMT reductions, which nobody's really discussed where they're going to come from. Those obviously are going to have some costs that have not been measured yet. Now, why are there differences between the ARB model and the Charles River Associate model? So the key is, at least in my mind, that the ARB assumes that there are these other market failures, that assumes consumers and firms are not there's something else out there that are forcing them to not make the correct decisions. Again, whether it be the air conditioner or a more fuel-efficient vehicle. And it's good that we have both models because this is a very unsettled topic in economics. Whether consumers are able to make the right choice in purchasing these long-lived durable goods that have energy prices in the future. There's some work on the car side that suggests they make very poor decisions. There's other work that I think is the best work out there, because it's my own, that suggests that consumers are making the right decisions. But that's just on the car side. We could point to so many durable goods where this is an issue. Insulation, air conditioners, refrigerators, principal agent problems between renters and landlords. Do the landlords really put in the right amount of insulation to save their renters' costs in the future? So there is at least scope for some of these complementary measures to have net benefits. And essentially the ARB is taking one side, saying that there are these other market failures, and the Charles River Associate model is basically assuming that there aren't. So that, I think, is, and they could correct me if I'm wrong, but that's probably the major source of disagreement between these two models. And it's good to have both sets out there, because I think reasonable people can disagree on the underlying assumptions, and it's good to see what happens if these other market failures exist. Just a quick note on some other models that are out there. So there's the Tanton model, which I think is fairly fine. So it doesn't have a computer-generated equilibrium model, so it's not allowing consumers and firms to adjust, as far as I can tell in their discussions. I think in some ways it's sort of misleading in the sense that it opens up saying, look, these firms are going to have to buy this much in permits. That's bad for these firms. But then it says, oh, consumers are going to have to pay this much more for these products. That's bad for consumers. That's a wash, or a lot of that is a wash. The firms are buying permits, but they're passing on those costs to consumers. So you don't want to double count that. And then, of course, this gives us no information about what the area underneath that curve is. It tells us what that rectangle is, but it doesn't tell us the area underneath the curve, which is what matters for calculating these costs. There's a Brattle study out there that focuses on small business. I think one of the things it ignores is what I would call indirect demand effects. So it's true, small businesses, they don't spend a lot on energy, but consumers are going to be spending more on gasoline and more on electricity. That money's got to come out of somewhere. So whether I go out to eat less often, that's an effect on small business. That's a more indirect on small business. The Varsity study, I think we could all agree in here, unless the authors are actually here, that this shouldn't be taken seriously. Okay, so what do we need more of? And then I'll end right here. So one is transparency. So one of the frustrating things with EAC was that one of the models, Energy 2020, was a proprietary model. So it was impossible for even the members to get under the hood of this model and actually look at what the technology cost curves and underlying assumptions. The ARB staff was was very responsive and very great in trying to actually trick the model into telling us what we wanted. But more transparency would have been nice. And the second is a discussion of the key parameters here. So for each of these complementary measures in cap and trade, you could point to where the savings are coming from, where the greenhouse gas reductions are coming from. If I was writing an academic study, I would then narrow in on some of the key parameters that are driving those savings and look at sensitivity analysis or what potential other assumptions could be made in those parameters and sources. And then the third, which policymakers never want to see but academics do, are confidence intervals. Most policymakers want one number. Academics want three. They want your best guess and they want a high and a low. And that's going to come from the fact that all of these hundreds of parameters that are inside of these models, we don't know what their actual values are. Each of those parameters have a confidence interval associated with them. And you could imagine taking the next 20 years and just simulating many of these models and spitting out a confidence interval. And then the third is again, these numbers where I hear consumers will have to spend $2,000 more under AB 32 than they otherwise would have, completely ignore the fact that we can auction these permits and give that money back. So the key number is that area under the curve, not what consumers, how much more they're paying for electricity or gasoline. When people ask me, well, is a gas tax regressive? I say a gas tax is whatever you want, because the gas tax generates revenue. You could give all the revenue back to the poor people, and it won't be regressive. It'll be progressive. So that's, I think, one of the misleading set of numbers that are being thrown out there. And with that, I'll stop.
But I'd really like to open up the panel to answer questions and take questions from the floor. Please identify yourself before you ask a question, and then maybe also direct your question to an individual member of the panel to start at least.
I'll keep it brief also. Ken Green, I'm with the American Enterprise Institute, and the question is for Chris. They're actually, I guess, twofold. One, if you're talking about ancillary benefits that you might get from AB 32, would it be more efficient if you simply went after them directly, or if you went after them indirectly as part of a much bigger package? And a secondary question is, can you name an instance in which government actually has auctioned off all of the permits and given that money back in substantial degree to the public?
So with the first, yes. So directly addressing a negative externality is always more efficient. Pricing NOx, we could basically have a gas tax that's based on your emissions. So yeah, I'd certainly take that. But insofar as we're not doing that, those are benefits coming from AB 32. Auctioning off money and giving it back to the consumers. So I think the best example is actually British Columbia, that has a carbon tax. And the legislature every year is required to show that those tax revenues went back to consumers. I think that's a perfect model for what we want to do here.
Hi, Chris Bush. I'm with the Center for Resource Solutions, and I'm a 2006 grad of ARE Berkeley. Wanted to get a little bit more at the issue of technology assumptions, and wanted to note that the CGE modeling is assuming a slower rate of energy efficiency innovation than has been seen historically. The autonomous energy efficiency improvement rate in the collaborative modeling we're talking about now assumed an improvement of 1.1% annually, when we've seen 1.5% annual improvement over the last 30 years. And then I guess to Kevin Kennedy, Chris Knittel mentioned sort of an effort to forecast future technology costs in these engineering inputs to the CGE modeling. And that's not my understanding. I've talked to David Kennedy. He says that you're using essentially current technology costs, and I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
I think that's to a large extent true, that we're not looking at technological innovation and sort of how that might drive costs. And actually, David, I don't know if you would want to say anything, since I think you've been attempting to sort of take that problem head on in some of the modeling work that you've been doing. So,
thank you, Kevin, and thanks, Chris. It's true that technological neutrality is a very rigorous assumption for a state like California, whose prosperity in the last 2 generations has been fueled by knowledge-intensive innovation. So actually, in the bear model, we've done a few scenarios. You can really only do scenario analysis since, as you know, perhaps the landscape of my profession, economics, is littered with the bones of people who have tried to estimate the innovation process. It's extremely difficult to predict the process of innovation, but we know that it happens. We know that California is a very fertile incubator of innovation, and so doing some of these scenarios, we found that actually very modest increases in energy efficiency would essentially moot almost all the differences that have arisen in these results. And I think it's very important to be aware of that relatively modest attainment of higher levels of energy efficiency would yield economic benefits far in excess of the cost that we're talking about here. And frankly speaking, if we take approaches to carbon mitigation that are as ambitious and determined as AB 32, really for the first time, it's not unreasonable to expect this. We've seen the venture community are among the most ardent advocates of this because they see the opportunity for energy efficiency and green technologies to be the next breakout global technology sector. And once again, let me just talk about this idea of the free rider problem. We have a very talented colleague at UC Berkeley who is a molecular biologist. He's been given a $30 million grant by the Gates Foundation to develop a cure for malaria. And he also has a private company that's experiencing tremendous speculative interest because of this, but not because California has malaria, not because the United States has malaria. This is because it's a technology that will generate enormous wealth for the innovators on the basis of the global need. So California, I think, is still has enormous potential to benefit from policies, even though the adoption costs for individuals are certainly positive. Anybody else want to respond to this discussion? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Tamara Raspberry from Semper Energy Utilities. And I'm not an economist, so I won't pretend like I understand everything that y'all will have presented today, but sitting for a year, these presentations, I do appreciate all the work that you have done on the analysis. So I do have a question about the assumptions. I think that LAO, I was interested if you made this assumption at all, that the revenue from the auction of the allowances, did you assume that they'd be generated back into AB 32 programs, or that the legislature would appropriate it into general fund? And I don't know if CRA did this also.
Thanks for the question. So in terms of our analysis of Proposition 23, that issue is highly, highly speculative, that there are some really key policy choices that need to be made in respect of cap and trade and how it would be implemented that have yet to be chosen. So the ARB is in the process of finishing off its regulation, which will include some of those policy choices, but also the really key policy choices that likely the legislature would need to make. I mean, the decision of how to use funding and appropriate funding from any new state revenue source is a legislative decision. So there's nothing out there now that provides any sort of guidance in terms of how any such auction revenues would be appropriated. The legislature hasn't set that policy. I guess a general comment, just to echo a comment that I think everyone has made, is that policy design really does matter in cap and trade and can phenomenally affect the economic impact of cap and trade. So design features such as the use of offsets, but also the use of any auction revenues and how that moves back into the economy can have a significant impact. So that's something that we're sort of monitoring and hope to, on an ongoing basis, advise the legislature of the policy choices that it has before it and that what it can make. The legislature has shown a little interest in this or I shouldn't say a little, some interest in this already. There's some proposed legislation dealing with offsets and other policy issues.
In terms of modeling recycling of auction revenue, basically in our model we do 100% auctioning, and it's kind of returned back lump sum to the consumers, and it's up to the consumers to decide how best they can spend it. And as Chris pointed out, we don't do any recycling of revenue that basically mitigates, distortionary taxes.
Yes.
Steve Kafka, UC Davis, and California Biomass Collaborative. I want to get, Dr. Knittel mentioned the notion of transparency. The low carbon fuel standard regulation bases its indirect land use change assessment on a CGE model that was chosen primarily, well, at least on one level, because it's publicly available and transparent. And they have argued, staff has argued that that was an essential feature of the AB 32 legislation. Is that not true generally for all economic models that are used in assessment of the effects of AB 32? For instance, I think Dr. Knittel mentioned that one of them is proprietary and that it has a fairly fundamental role in guiding CARB's analysis.
I would say that our preference in general is for using publicly available models, but when you're looking at something like Energy 2020, which is one of the key models that we used, that sort of detailed model looking at the energy flows through the economy, similar in terms of, say, the Charles River Associates model, those models of that degree of detail and sophistication tend not to be models that are publicly available. And so we had made the choice when we were starting up on the scoping plan economic analysis that the value that that sort of model would provide to the overall analysis outweighed the fact that the model itself was proprietary.
Let me just say the research is certainly going in that direction, and for the work that we're doing, we find heterogeneity, as we call it, is very important in terms of the incidence. And we're doing some experiments to look at things like green microcredit and other initiatives that can help to correct for what I call capital market failures, that is higher cost of capital for smaller enterprises. So there is a lot of interest in this in the research areas, but it's not reflected in the currently available results.